Hi, and welcome to this episode of Frankie Mary in Westborough. I'm one of your hosts, Shelby Marshall. I'm proudly serving as a member of the Select Board. I'm normally joined by my co-host, Arthur Bergeron. He's an attorney here in town as part of the Myrick O'Connell firm. But Arthur is not with us today. He has another commitment. So I'm going to go it alone, and hopefully our ratings don't tank. If they do, we'll know who the real star of the show is other than our guests. And speaking of guests, I'm thrilled to welcome Jenn Doherty. Jenn is chair of the Westborough Historical Commission, and she's also chair of the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee. And that's a mouthful, so try not to say that too many times. I am also a member of that exploratory committee. There are several members from town departments, other boards, committees, and residents that are part of that. That was a committee that was appointed by the Select Board to explore Westborough's opportunity to bring forward an article or basically to determine whether or not Westborough wants to pursue adding CPA to its, I guess, resources, if you will. So Jenn and I and others have been working hard on this project, and the purpose of the show is really to give you an update on where we're at. We've had multiple public meetings with boards and committees. If you're watching this, you may have already heard some of it, but hopefully you'll learn something new. But it's really an opportunity to bring folks up to speed as to what the Community Preservation Act is, why it's good for Westborough, because candidly, we're biased about that, and how Westborough can benefit from it in its in projects going forward. So Jenn, welcome.
And thank you for having me, Shelby.
Yeah, so Jenn, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you. We've talked a little bit about some of the things that we want to cover, and that really starts with first bringing our friends Frank and Mary up to speed with what is the CPA. It's not an accountant. Some people get that confused, but it is a Community Preservation Act, and what is it and how could it benefit Westborough?
Sure, so the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, is legislation that was adopted by the state in the early 2000s, and it allows communities, once they adopt it, to place a surcharge on their real estate taxes of up to 3%. That surcharge is then matched with funds from the state, and those funds the community then uses for projects in one of three categories: open space and recreation, affordable housing, and historic preservation. The funds are controlled at the local level, so communities have to vote at town meeting on how they want to expend their funds. So it's really a great way to fund a lot of those programs in communities, programs and projects in communities that really often don't get a lot of funding. And the community can directly choose what they do want to fund in their community. So far to date, about 187 communities in the state have adopted the Community Preservation Act, including many of our neighbors, Northborough, Southborough, Grafton, Upton, and Hopkinton, and Shrewsbury have all adopted CPA so far.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned surcharge and tax, and people may have just muted us and dropped the show, but I hope they didn't. I hope they're still watching. So let's talk a little bit. I want to talk about the numbers. What does this typically look like for the average household and property here in Westborough? And then, but before that, let's talk a little bit about how would CPA ultimately be adopted here in Westborough? What's that process?
Sure. So our board, as you mentioned, has been appointed. We were appointed back in November of 2020. And we've been meeting once, twice a month to kind of explore CPA and how it would work here in Westborough. And ultimately, we are going to make a recommendation to the Select Board about whether or not Westborough should adopt CPA. Our goal right now is to make that recommendation in either December of this year or January of 2022. If the Select Board agree, if we recommend that CPA should be adopted and the Select Board agrees, they would then place it on the annual town meeting warrant for spring of 2022. If a majority of voters at town meeting agree, The question of CPA then goes on to the next regularly scheduled ballot, which would be in November of 2022. And again, if a majority of voters agree there, Westborough would have adopted CPA and would begin collecting funds the following year.
And that is a simple majority, right, Jen?
Yes, a simple majority.
In both cases, both town meeting and ballot. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. And the town meeting process, because you mentioned that there's a surcharge and there's a range up to 3%. So we'll talk about the numbers in a minute. The warrant article, will it define what that surcharge is? Is it multiple warrant articles? How will that look?
Yep, so it would be one warrant article that basically says Westborough is adopting the CPA, and here are the parameters that we're adopting. So it would include our surcharge percentage. Again, that can be up to anything up to 3%. And then the state legislation also allows communities to adopt several exemptions if they so choose. So those exemptions include things like exempting the first $100,000 of value from all properties in the community, exemptions for low income residents and low and moderate income senior residents, and then exemptions for commercial and property taxes, commercial and real industrial properties. So communities can decide among those exemptions which they would like to choose, and those would go in the warrant article as well, and it would be adopted as a bundle. Okay,
and then basically that same language then, and however it needs to be tweaked after a town meeting vote, appears on the ballot to then be voted on.
Exactly. Yep. And then it's a yes/no question on the ballot.
Okay. And what if it passes at town meeting, then goes to the ballot and doesn't pass? That is null and void then on the town meeting vote. Is that correct?
Exactly. So then Westborough doesn't pass CPA, and you could bring it up again in the future, but that one first time did not pass.
Okay. And is there a time frame in which a town can revisit that after it's been on the ballot?
After it's been on the ballot, I'm not sure, but I think, you could bring it to the next election. You do have to kind of start the process over again, and you would have to bring it back to town meeting first and then go back to another ballot.
I'm anticipating positive support, but, kind of want to ask what the what if question. You mentioned something about this being the first time this has come before Westborough. So I know from being on the committee and working with you, there's sort of a little bit of urban legend that this has already come before Westborough and the voters have already voiced their opinion at town meeting. That's actually not the case. Westborough has not actually brought forth CPA in all of its parts and pieces and logistics before the town, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So before CPA, and really what CPA was modeled on, was a program down the Cape that was to preserve open space, and it was just for open space. And it was a real estate transfer tax. So when you sold a property in your community, generally the seller would pay a tax on that sale, and the tax that they paid would then go into this fund to fund open space preservation. That was again adopted down the Cape by a number of communities down there. And it did come onto the warrant in Westborough in around 1998 or 1999. However, it was ultimately tabled at town meeting. So town meeting didn't actually take a vote on it. The following year, in 2000, it turned into, that program essentially turned into CPA as we know it today. And that's when the state enabling legislation was passed for CPA.
So there could be some natural confusion that, we've already revisited this, but it was very different in both its funding source and even the state matching grant, which we'll talk about that in just a moment here, was different.
Yeah, exactly. It was only limited to open space acquisition. You didn't have the affordable housing or historic preservation component, or even the recreation component. And the funding, as you noted, was different. It was a real estate transfer tax and not a property tax surcharge, or you didn't have the match from the state. So that's maybe where some of the confusion comes from, but it was an early precursor to CPA that really, wasn't tested in Westborough or didn't actually come to a vote in Westborough.
Okay, so we'll talk about kind of how the monies could be used, but let's actually talk about the surcharge. I think you may have a slide you want to share with us to talk about kind of the actual numbers.
Yep, so I can bring up a slide that I have showing the process.
And as you're doing that, I would say that as a committee, we have very conscientiously tried to keep our recommendation in what we would consider a very affordable range. Now, that's a very subjective term, depending upon your property valuation and just your view in general. But I want to assure Frank and Mary that has been a very consistent theme. If you were to watch any of our meetings, which you can look at the minutes that are posted online. We've been very conservative in what we've put forth. And I would say, Jen, I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of things, as we've talked with other members in the community, they've actually said, why aren't we starting with a higher surcharge percentage, which really has been quite surprising to me, since I'm always getting kind of challenged on what our taxes are. But we're trying to make this affordable so that we can engage with the state's trust fund and receive those monies, and while still making it an investment in Westborough's future, but not at an amount that breaks the bank, so to speak. So Jen, please, the slide.
So here is our slide showing how CPA is calculated, the surcharge is calculated. And as Shelby mentioned, we really wanted to kind of stick to that $50 a year average for the average single family tax bill. And again, the important thing to note with CPA, and often a point of confusion, is that it's actually calculated on the amount that you pay in taxes, and it's not calculated on the valuation of your property. So those are obviously two very different numbers. Up to 3% calculated on $10,000 versus up to 3% calculated on your $500,000 valuation.
Right.
So running through the numbers real quick, the average residential valuation for a single family home in Westborough is just over $530,000. Our committee did talk about adopting the first $100,000 valuation exemption. So you would take $100,000 off of that $530,000 valuation. The current tax rate is $18.54 per $1,000. So calculating that on the $430,000 number gives you an $8,000 tax bill. And so to kind of stay around that $50 range that we mentioned, we were looking at a 0.5% surcharge on that $8,000 tax bill, which would be around a $40 a year surcharge on the property tax bill for the average single family homeowner.
So just to be clear, because taxes sometimes they go down, generally they go up, that $40 would be expected to change in this example year over year. So the percent wouldn't change because that would be written into the legislation for the town, but the dollar amount could change year over year based on the tax rate.
Yes, exactly. And obviously, similarly, if your property is valued at more or less than $530,000, your tax rate or your CPA surcharge would be more or less than $40 a year.
Right. Okay.
And so we did also calculate all of the surcharge rates on this average single family homeowner bill of $530,000, house valued at $530,000. So again, you see that 0.5% surcharge would be around $40 for the average homeowner, going all the way up to a full 3% surcharge, which would be a $240 surcharge on the average single family tax bill. But the important piece there is what's in the middle. That's the money that we would generate through this surcharge. So the second column is the total surcharge revenue that we would collect from the town. The middle column is what our state match would be estimated to be at. Right now, the state match is around 30% of what the town collects. And then the second from right column would be our total CPA revenue generated at each surcharge level per year. And this is based obviously on the current fiscal year information.
And so, Jen, I don't know if you have another slide that you want to share to kind of talk about the state matching. I mean, you mentioned 30% right now, which is great, because I think it's important that Frank and Mary understand right now, 187 other communities are benefiting from this 30% match, and Westborough isn't, and yet we're still paying into the state's CPA trust fund.
Yeah, that's an important point. So the state's CPA trust fund is generated through fees collected at the Registry of Deeds. So every time you record a document at the Registry of Deeds, so if you sell a property, buy a property, if you put your property into a trust, if you refinance your mortgage, anything like that where you're recording a document at the Registry of Deeds, you are paying a fee that goes directly into the state's CPA trust fund. Now, all communities pay those fees, and all their fees go into that trust fund, regardless of whether the community has adopted CPA or not. So for the past 20 years, where Westborough hasn't adopted CPA, our residents have been paying those fees, and those fees are then going to our neighbors as their CPA trust fund. So this would give us an opportunity to collect those funds back, essentially get 30 cents on the dollar back from the state, and funds that are really already being paid by our community.
Great. And so, so let's talk a little bit about the exemption, because you focused on, we talk a lot about residential. This does impact businesses as well. So it would be the surcharge that is determined, or at least sort of the path that our committee has been going down, would be the surcharge that applies to residential properties would apply to businesses. So if it's 0.5 or 1% or whatever the number ends up being, it would be applied equally. We have discussed the $100,000 being applied to both residential and commercial, industrial, etc. So everyone gets that minus 100,000 right off the top. And then there's a low income $100,000, or excuse me, exemption, as well. Correct, Jen?
Yes, there is. And so I have another slide that shows the income limits for that.
Great, thank you.
So here you can see the different income limits for the low and moderate income residents. So the exemption for low income residents would be for all low income residents of any age within the community. And you can see that it's based on our area-wide median income and your household size. And then there is also, when you adopt that low income exemption, there's also an exemption for low and moderate income senior residents. So for those over 60 years old who fall into one of these lower moderate income categories. So this would completely exempt those residents from paying the CPA surcharge.
And Jen, the slide you showed us before, actually, and the numbers that the revenue that we would generate actually, correct me if I'm wrong, does apply both of these exemptions?
It doesn't, because
it doesn't. Okay.
Yeah, we weren't sure, obviously, how many people would ultimately request these exemptions. And the assessor, when they developed the numbers that we were looking at, didn't think that there were that many residents that would ultimately qualify or would ultimately request these exemptions.
Right.
So potentially the numbers that we showed could be slightly lower if we do have lower income residents.
Okay, but the 100,000 is just a number right off the top. So that was reflected in that prior slide.
Yes, and so that one is reflected. That's 100,000 straight off of everyone's property in the town. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Frank and Mary, for that confusion there. So let's get to the projects, because this is where it sort of gets exciting. And someone has asked me, actually I've received multiple questions like, why would you as a select board member want to, if you're going to do a project, why not just bring forward, have the project come forward and have it be voted on at town meeting and raise, appropriate, borrow what the money's needed for that. I like this one because of the state matching. It's nice that anytime where the town has done a great job over the past number of years in applying for grants, and we've been really successful in applying those grants to a number of different projects, and we should do that at any point. This is not a grant, but I'm using that parallel. The other thing is that I like it that these monies have a specific allocation. So we collect X amount, we get a match from the state, and then we are aligning our commitment to affordable housing and open space by a 10% allocation of what is what we've generated, if you will. And then we can determine among all three buckets, recreation, open space, affordable housing, and historical preservation, how the balance of that money would be spent. But I want to be very clear that ultimately, even once CPA is adopted, there's money just doesn't get spent. There's a very scripted process per the legislation where the town would need to establish a CPA committee, and that committee would bring forward projects working in cooperation with other town committees and certainly town departments. And then ultimately, because it is our process, we would bring those to open town meeting. Fair to say, Jen?
Yep, so the CPA legislation requires communities, as you said, to set up a community preservation committee. And that includes representatives from boards such as the Planning Board, Conservation Commission, Historical Commission, Parks and Recreation, so that they're knowledgeable about the different kinds of projects that will be coming forward. They also have to prepare a community preservation plan that outlines how the community wants to spend their CPA funds over the coming years. As you noted, they'll take in the applications usually once a year, usually in the fall for communities that have town meeting. And then in the spring, after reviewing all those applications, they'll present a slate of proposed projects to town meeting for town meeting to vote on and approve the funds. Some other things to note though about the CPA funds, they don't expire. So it's not like general fund money where it's just going to disappear on June 30th. So you can bank the funds for future years. For instance, if you know that a large piece of land is going to be coming up for sale in a few years, you can sort of save your money for future purchases. And then similarly, the funds stay in their CPA buckets. It does not get rolled over into the general fund, and they can't be used for anything outside of the CPA categories. So it really is dedicated funding for these purposes. And again, something that town meeting ultimately votes on how they want to spend their funds.
And I think in the past, the town meeting voters have been very supportive of a variety of projects across the sectors we're talking about. But I'm sure that there are projects that haven't come forward that would benefit from CPA, as well as others that we've discussed. And Jen, I think you have a couple slides, you can bring those up, where there's potential for where we could have offset borrowing or use of other funds to benefit a project that town meeting was widely supportive of. So let's talk about some of the fun things we can do to enhance the quality of life here in Westborough through CPA.
Sure, so I have a few examples from some of our neighboring communities, some projects that they've done.
So another first one you're going to bring up is affordable housing. And as I think Frank and Mary are well aware, the town recently established an affordable housing trust. We've moved money from other projects that were part of mitigation into that fund. So, and affordable housing has been a consistent theme in our strategic plan to make sure that we have affordable housing for a wide range of demographics. And as well as it's certainly a theme in our master plan. So this is something the town is committed to. We've talked a lot about, and CPA again gives us the opportunity to actually commit these funds to various projects. So Jen, please.
Yep, so some of the funds or some of the projects that our neighbors have funded in the past few years in Northborough, some folks may be familiar with this property. It's right in downtown Northborough. But it's a former general store that they converted into several units of affordable housing, working with Habitat for Humanity, I believe. Recently, over the past year, Hopkinton has been using $90,000 of their affordable housing CPA funds for an emergency housing relief program for rental assistance for those impacted by COVID. And then again, recently in Northborough, they demolished their former senior center and constructed several units of apartments there that are dedicated for senior housing. So those are some of the current affordable housing projects. And so then moving to historic preservation. Folks may be familiar with the Burnett Garfield House in Southborough. It was recently saved by a group of young teenagers. Yeah. So the community, Southborough, has purchased a preservation restriction on the property, which will help protect it in the future. And they've also provided CPA funds to rehabilitate the property. Upton Town Hall was recently renovated using CPA funds. And then in Northborough, of course, folks are likely familiar with White Cliffs, which the town has purchased to protect it from development, and is looking at turning it into either an event space or office space. Either the town will manage or that they'll lease out.
Great.
And so finally, for the open space and recreation category, Grafton and Upton have both acquired large parcels. Portions of them outright, portions of them purchasing conservation restriction on them to prevent future development. And the one in Upton is a good example of what Shelby was mentioning. CPA funds can be used as a match for federal and state grants. So it can help further our monies even more. And then finally, in Grafton, they rehabilitated a playground in North Grafton. So those are just some examples of the different kinds of projects that communities around us have been doing with CPA.
And one of the other, speaking of open space and recreation, one of the changes that recently came out, and I'll call it an enhancement to CPA, is that CPA funds, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, can be used for trails.
Yeah, so they could always be used for trails, but the concern was around rail trails, and it was related to federal requirements that rails be banked, and that rail companies could eventually take back over rail trails to use them for an active rail line again. However, it seems like from what I've heard from the open space folks here in Westborough, that actually wasn't an issue with our proposed B-Wall trail. But the CPA funds could certainly still be used for the B-Wall, for construction on it, for purchase of easements and things like that.
Sure. So I think, and again, just another kind of creative way in which we could apply funds to, projects that, again, we haven't committed, town meeting hasn't, fully supported the B-Wall yet. It's going to come back before town meeting, but it's another way to look at what would be a significant project and then say, could we offset, what we have to borrow or grant money or what have you. So, okay. I'm looking at the time. Jen, before I kind of just transition to a quick COVID update, anything else you'd like to say about CPA before we close out here?
I don't think I have anything else, but I did want to share just a few next steps and how folks can contact us.
Perfect.
So we've been speaking with several boards and commissions, but now we're going to start looking to the wider public to gather input. So you can visit our website, which is on the town's page. We have a short quiz and a survey up there that we'd love for folks to complete. We do currently have 2 public meetings scheduled. One is on Wednesday, September 29th, and the other is on Thursday, October 7th, both at 7 p.m. And as I said before, our goal is ultimately to present a recommendation to the select board in December or January. And folks can also email us at our email address if they have any comments or questions about CPA.
So I really encourage Frank and Mary to bring their friends along to the one of the meetings that Jen just posted. And before you come, I encourage you to watch one of our presentations that Westborough TV was kind enough to record, so you can really understand the detail of it, and then use your opportunity before the CPA Exploratory Committee as an opportunity to ask questions. So I want to thank Jen. Just a really quick update. I'm not going to bore folks with numbers. COVID is still in the news. We're still in a pandemic, and unfortunately the numbers are going up. I do want to ask folks in Westborough to please mask up if you are not vaccinated. If you're going to the library, everyone is required to wear a mask, and just be kind and be safe out there. So thank you very much, and we'll hope to have Arthur back on our next show in this installment of Frank and Mary. Thanks for watching.